3. Let's get started. And we are... Ron? Okay, so today we're finishing up our section on predestination. And remember, we ended up talking last week about the arguments for and the arguments against semi-Pelagianism, which we now know is very prevalent within both the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, many of the branches of the Protestant Church. So it's interesting how, some of these things come about, when the Bible is finally put together and everyone is now looking and studying, again, they're differing opinions, so it's not just everyone sits down and says, wow, this is one fantastic book. I'm glad we added all these books together. And then they said, let's talk about theology, and 100% of them come out. We all think the same. Never worked like that. It never worked like that then. It won't work like that now. It'll never work like that in the future. As long as there are opinions, there's going to be, differing. And so, if you're the established church, or if you're the Orthodox Church, if you think outside the box, depending on whose perspective, you're a heretic. Yeah. At least today we don't burn heretics at stakes. They just go off and start new denominations. But that's a lot better than burning people, right? I hope you all agree with that. All right. So today, I think last week we finished with the 3 basic rules about predestination. 1, we must take all biblical passages seriously, including those that seem to support the other side. Because when it comes to things like predestination and free will, that we use to build up our understandings or our theological systems about salvation, remember, just because us Presbyterians will say, oh, look at all these wonderful scriptures that support predestination, our Methodist brothers and sisters will be looking and say, oh, look at all these wonderful passages that support free will. And there is. And so if we want to look at it and do serious theological study, you must look at all scriptures, even the ones that do not support, our or your perspective. Right? You can't just ignore things. 2, it is a summary of good news for all, right? Guthrie was not a big fan of double predestination. All right? And 3, it is not just for us, but for the non-Christians as well. So Guthrie, and it was interesting, towards the end of his lifetime, there were some of my peers who had him. I've never had a class with Guthrie. He retired either as I got there or he was retiring, and then he passed on. I want to say it was my middle year. He passed away. But a lot of people thought that Guthrie was becoming a universalist in his latter years. So, so when we think about that, but he was very big on, we must understand that Christ died for the world, not just for the chosen, right? So when we think about that, in the framework of Reformed theology, we must make sure to understand that Jesus, if you do believe in predestination, or we hold to that, you cannot just believe that Jesus died only for the elect, only for the church, right? If we take John's gospel seriously, Christ died for everybody, all right? Now, it doesn't make anything easier when it comes to trying to figure out how predestination works, but Jesus did not just die for the elect, right? He died for the world.
Or for those who thought they are elect.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is one of the issues, I think, with Calvin was, I know I am saved, but how do you know? Or I have that conviction that I am, but there's no other thing, that's it.
Well, yeah. Well, all of this is built upon faith.
Yeah.
Right? So even theological systems are built upon faith.
Yeah.
To where we say, well, how do you know you're saved? Well, you just know.
Mm-hmm.
But then this person who says, if you're talking to like maybe 5 Christians in a room, and they all could be Presbyterians, and you can say, well, are you saved? And you might have someone that says, yes, most definitely, I know I'm saved. I feel it, I believe it, and the next person might say, well, I hope I'm saved. I believe what I'm supposed to believe. I live the way I'm supposed to live, hopefully, and then, so you might get a variation amongst these 5 people, and then my question would be, well, who's saved? And it's everybody, if they're filled with the Spirit. It doesn't make a difference if you know for certain or if you hope, and you love Christ and you live the right life and you do what you're supposed to do. We're all different. It's no different than, if you look at, a professor once gave the scenario of the Passover, and Moses tells everyone what to do, and everyone's going home, and they're, putting the blood on the door frame, and everyone sit down for the meal, right? They prepared a meal, and they're eating. And one family is comfortable, they're relaxed, God's got control of this, we're going to be okay. The family next door, they're nervous. They hear screams, they don't know what's going on outside, they have no idea what's going on. They have, they're hoping that whatever's out there is not going to come in here. So the professor says, well, whose house does the angel of death spare? Well, it's both, because they both did what they were told to do. They both put the blood on the doorpost, right? It's so one person is calm, one person is nervous. It doesn't make a difference, Why one person is cool as a cucumber and the other person has anxiety doesn't mean that they're they're the same. It means that one struggles with something that the other does not struggle with, right? So when we think about understanding predestination or theological frameworks, skeletal work, it's all built on faith. It's faith, but it's framework, but it's, but again, it's faith.
Yeah.
You believe in this framework.
But the worrisome discussion in my mind is when you start figuring out if somebody else is saved.
Yes.
Like, I'm saved, but I don't think that
Right.
Napoli is saved.
Yeah.
Or this other guy is saved.
Yeah.
This is,
Yeah, you can't do that.
this
Right.
becomes,
Most definitely. And that's problematic.
yeah.
Then we become gatekeepers.
Mhm.
We try to figure out who's in, who's out. Then instead of operating a church, you're operating a country club.
Yeah.
You don't, it doesn't work like that. We don't have that capability. Or that's God's job. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Bless you. So, most definitely. And there are people who do that. There are people who feel within their right to judge who's in and who's out.
You're out.
Yeah. And it just, from what I know, from what I've studied, I just can't put that, it doesn't work for me. Doesn't work. I don't want that job.
No.
Yeah.
I don't want that job. That's God's job. My job is to serve, to love, to teach, to do what I'm called to do.
Mhm.
God's job is to save, not mine.
Right, and he doesn't need any help from
And
me.
he doesn't need any help from me. Exactly correct.
He's big enough.
He's big enough to do that job all by God's self.
Yeah.
The way I understand it is we're given the privilege to be a part of the process. But just because we're part of the process doesn't mean that we're the ones doing it. We are called to help to witness. We are called to serve. We are called to feed. We are called to spread the word. But the work, the actual act of saving, of the filling of the Spirit, has nothing to do with us. We don't do that. We don't have that kind of power. We just don't. So when I hear people say, I spread the word. I was talking to my friend and I saved him, and I'm just like, you say from what? Drowning? What did you save him from?
The bus.
Yeah, right. He was almost hit by a bus, right? So we must always keep in mind that these frameworks, whatever theological framework they are, they're built upon faith. They're very logical. To me, theology is a lot like logic or a lot like mathematics, and it builds upon itself. And this is why, it's hard to take some from a Methodist framework and a Roman Catholic framework and a Presbyterian framework and maybe a little from the Lutheran framework. I'm going to go ahead and make my own. It doesn't work. It's like pulling stuff from base 10 and base 3 and base 4 and just trying to make it fit. And it doesn't. It can't. It doesn't work. Because it all built, whatever system it is, it's built upon itself.
Well, actually, you can translate from base 3 to base 10.
Yeah, you would have to do the translation. But then it would no longer be base 3.
It's 2.5.
Oh, yeah. God, I remember doing that. I think it was 7th grade. I absolutely hated that stuff.
You ever see there are 1-0 types of people in the world, those who understand binary and those who don't?
Wait, let me say that
There are
again.
10 types of people in the world.
Yeah, it looks like 10 types of people in the world, those who understand binary and those who don't. Because 1-0 in binary is
It's
2.
2.
Got it. Got it. All right, so those are the 3 basic rules for thinking about predestination. Now, we're going to go to Guthrie, point 4, freedom, the freedom God wills for all human beings. And for that, we're going to go to his book, 132 to 133. All right, the freedom God wills for all human beings. As we have seen repeatedly, one of the persistent problems we encounter in trying to understand predestination is that it seems to force us to choose between 2 equally unacceptable alternatives. On the one hand, if we believe in the plan and work of a sovereign God in the history of the world and in our own lives, we seem to be forced to deny the significance of human decisions and actions. What meaning can human freedom have if God determines everything that happens? On the other hand, if we insist on the freedom of human beings to choose and determine their own destiny, we are forced to deny the sovereignty of God. What significance can a plan and purpose of God have if what God can do depends on what we will do? The sovereignty of God or human freedom? That seems to be the choice we have to make. So long as we think theoretically and abstractly about this problem, there is no solution to it. But what if we think about it in light of what concrete human experience tells us about the kind of people we are and what Scripture tells us about the kind of God the predestinating God is? Although we might not like to admit it, honest analysis of our own experience tells us that, in the deepest sense, none of us is really free. What we will and how we live is determined to a large extent by where and when we were born. We think and act with the limited point of view and biases of our particular race, cultural environment, and national heritage, with the fears and prejudices of rural, suburban, or city people, with the narrow self-interest of people who are poor, middle class, or rich, with the advantages or disadvantages of a healthy or crippling family background. Moreover, what we want and strive for is motivated to a large extent by anxiety, pride, envy, greed, and lust. Think of the various motives exploited by advertising and television commercials to manipulate us into buying cars and cosmetics. Even when we are not always aware of it, we are driven and controlled by all kinds of social and psychological forces that determine our attitudes, decisions, and actions. And many of them alienate us both from God, who loves other kind of people as much as our kind, and from other people, especially those who are different from us. So that our enslavement to all these external and internal powers is what Scripture calls our enslavement to sin. The brutal fact is that we are not nearly as free as we like to think. Attractive as it is, the Pelagian position is simply not realistic. We desperately need to become free. That is just what predestination is all about. It is about the sovereign will of God, who desires everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. The truth that God desires all to know is the truth about Jesus Christ, truth that makes us free. The sovereign plan of God is not an alternative or threat to human freedom, it is the source of human freedom. Once we see predestination in the light of God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ and a realistic evaluation of the human predicament, it becomes sheer good news. For God's sovereignty is not just another power that seeks to dominate and control us at the expense of our own free human willing and doing. It is the sovereignty of God's love, God's plan to free us from slavery to all the internal and external psychological and social powers that enslave and dehumanize us in order that we might be genuinely free people. People who discover and fulfill their own true humanity as they freely love God and their fellow human beings, all of them. Predestination or human freedom? No. Predestination and therefore human freedom.
That's good stuff.
Yeah. Guthrie was fantastic. Well, he sat under Karl Barth. I mean, that's pretty big. So
He turns the tables, doesn't he?
he does turn the tables.
Yeah.
He does turn the tables. And when you think about it, I love this passage of his book because it really does. I mean, we are not as free as we think we are, right? And this is not, when you think about it, this is not just Christianity's way of looking at it. I mean, even, the Buddhist understanding is very similar. We are not really trapped, but, life is suffering. And it's to figure out how to get out of that cycle of suffering. So here, for Guthrie, good morning, is saying that we really are not free. And I love the way he says, just think about practical life. He takes a different path and says, okay, let's stop talking about theology for a moment. And let's just look at life in general. How free are we? And we're not. We are, but we're not, right? We're bombarded with things. And this is where, one of my professors who was from Germany, and she said, we don't have an issue with predestination in Germany. We just accept it. It is what it is. It is what it is. So worldviews play into this, right? Everything play into this. Our systems, who we are, how we were raised, were we rich, were we poor, were we blue collar, white collar, were we hugged enough as kids, did we go to a good school, did we not like school? Everything is imagine like a big pot of soup and you're throwing stuff into it, and that's us, each of us, right? All of these things go into creating who we are. It's not right or wrong or bad or good. Guthrie is saying it just is what it is, right? And that we are continually bombarded, so we're really not free. And so what Guthrie is saying, something like predestination, right? The sovereign will of God is a good thing because it's not trapping, it's freeing, right? It's a release. It's saying that God knows that we are all enslaved by so many things and that Christ wants to release us from them, right? And that's part of the good news. And that's part of the good news. So Guthrie takes, as Don said, a nice turn, right? Turning the tables. I like that. By moving out of this theological perspective and looking at it in a very practical way. And saying, do you really think you're free?
I've got news for you.
Do you really think you're free? Because you're not, right? But the good news is that what Christ is offering is pure freedom, under the law of Christ. Good. All right. So, now, Guthrie also says, well, let's talk about the meaning of predestination for non-Christians. This one's a lot shorter. We have seen that when Christians think about predestination, they think about God's plan to unite all things in Jesus Christ, to have mercy on all, for God desires all to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth that sets people free. What does this mean when we think about the consequences of Christian doctrine of predestination for non-Christians? All right, so now what Guthrie does is he breaks this up into three sections. The first is God's love. Okay? So if we look at non-Christians in the light of God's plan for all in Christ, we are permitted and we are required to believe that God is for them too, desires their salvation too, works in their lives and in the world around them to enable them too to be genuinely free human beings. It may be true that they do not yet believe or no longer believe or partially believe. Perhaps they will never believe. Such people do not live as those whom God chooses, as God chooses, love, helps, and saves. But that does not mean that we may decide that God is against them, as Suhail brought out about 20 minutes ago, right? So it's God's love. It's not our job to play gatekeeper, right? The church, like I said earlier, is not a country club that we get to choose who's in and who's out. It is our calling to love all people. It is our calling to serve all people, not just the church. Who is my neighbor? Right? We are to love our neighbors. The Bible doesn't say you are to love the church. We are, but we are to love all people, right? If we only love ourselves, if we only love the inside, right, the members of the church, how then are we living the life of the gospel? How will other people even know about the gospel? They won't. If we become an insular organization where we do everything inside these walls, and then when we leave these walls, you do whatever you want, never talk about Christ, don't live as Christians, do whatever you want, the world would never know.
And if we did operate that way, we'd never get any new members.
That's correct. No church would ever get any new members.
Right.
So this is why I have a fundamental disagreement with churches that have everything inside. You know, because I believe that you should live in your community. You should get coffee at your local coffee shop and mingle with people in that coffee shop. You go to a gym, pick any gym you want that you like, but go to a gym away from the church. Go play basketball in the park. Go shoot hoops where there's people that you can encounter, right? This is not our job to live in a compound, you know, waiting for Jesus to come back. It's our job to be out where? In the fields, living with each other, living with our neighbor, right? So if we take God's love seriously, we must be involved in the lives of all people within our neighbors, right? And that's, so we can't say, well, predestination, God called me, you're all firewood, and bye-bye, good luck on the other side. No, that's not what Guthrie says. Whoa, stop. You have no idea where people are. You have no idea if they will one day come to a decision, because they are. We have no idea. Remember, when we think about predestination, this is how we understand the process. But in some point in our lives, we were on a spiritual journey ourselves. And perhaps each of us, you think about when you came to that realization that you belong to Christ. And it's not going to be the same for anybody. And we are still on spiritual journeys throughout our entire lives. So it's, the word sanctification means it's this continual walk through life, this spiritual journey to become closer and closer with God. But it's a journey. And we all are on these journeys. And so are non-Christians, right? It's a journey as well. And so when you think about the parable of the sower and the seed, you know, we don't know where we are in any process. You know, we're not supposed to be gatekeepers. We're supposed to love our neighbors and serve them, feed them, clothe them, befriend them. There's no difference, you know, no difference at all. It's not our job to save or to say, hey, you're in and you're out, right? So Guthrie says, no, get out there. Live amongst your neighbors. Love your neighbors. All right.
I like how you put it. When you come to the realization that you're for Christ.
Yes.
You say that when you come to the choice that you make.
Right.
You just
When
said
you
that-
choose Christ.
Yeah, you said when you come to the realization.
Right.
And I
For
like-
me,
I like
theologically, the way I understand it is when I came to the realization.
And it's
Right.
beautiful
That I
us
have been
seeing
saved.
that,
He has
you know?
to choose you first.
Right.
There's one
Right.
Bible passage that Christ says, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's correct. That's correct. And so when you think about that, for me, it's not, okay, I was saved at that moment, the way I theologically understand it is when I came to the understanding that I was saved.
Yeah.
Right? That Christ died on the cross 2,000 years ago, and it was for me too. Right? So for me, it was a realization.
I like that.
And yeah, but other people, think differently.
Yeah.
But for me,
Yeah.
it's a realization. It's a realization. All right, so now remember, you can't talk about God's love without talking about what?
Justice.
That's right. All right, so God's judgment. 2. It is true that there are people, not all of them non-Christians, I like that part, who set themselves in opposition to God's promises and commandments. As long as this opposition continues, God's love, can only be expressed as judgment and wrath against them, because for their own good, God cannot and will not let them get by with the ways they destroy their own lives when they refuse to live by God's promises and requirements. This means that although we cannot believe that some are rejected by God from the beginning, as double predestination teaches, neither can we say that God must eventually save all people, as universalism teaches. Some may not want God's love and help, the true freedom, God's love and help, and the true freedom that God offers. But even when we take this into account, we are neither allowed nor required to judge whether any particular person or whole groups of people will be finally saved or damned. God alone is judge. God has not turned the decision about anyone's final destiny over to us, but is quite competent to decide without our help, opinions, or advice. I like that statement. Meanwhile, we may be sure that in dealing with non-Christians as well as with Christians, God's decision will be not only just but also loving. Instead of following Calvin's example of deciding that only a few will finally be saved, we would do better to follow the example of chapter 10 of the Second Helvetic Confession. And although God knows who are his, and here and there mention is made of a small number of elect, yet we must hope well of all and not rashly judge any man to be a reprobate. Or to put it in the words of the Declaration of Faith, we live in tension between God's warning and promises. Knowing the righteous judgment of God in Christ, we urge all people to be reconciled to God, not exempting ourselves from the warnings. Constrained by God's love in Christ, we have good hope for all people, not exempting the most unlikely from the promises. Judgment belongs to God and not to us. We are sure that God's future for every person will be both merciful and just. So when we think about God's judgment, again, not our call. Not our call. We don't get to make that call. I love what Guthrie says. God is quite competent to decide without our help, opinions, or advice. Doesn't need him. Doesn't need him. I don't care who you are. God doesn't need them. All right, so when we look at how we deal with non-Christians, again, we are to be the same with them. We don't wish anyone to damnation. Right? The Bible even says that. Don't wish anyone to damnation. I mean, it's a bad thing. It's God's job. It's God's job to do that. It's not our job. So we must live our lives as Christians by treating all people as if they are God's children. Right? And if this is not what is meant to be, if they are going to reject, then that's between God and that individual, not us. Right? We are still called to love and to serve everyone, right? To be there for everyone. And that includes those who scoff our faith, right? You think about what Jesus endured. Think about what Jesus endured in his ministry, even on the cross. Think about what he endured. And yet he still said what?
Forgive them.
Forgive them why?
What they do.
They do not know what they do. Right. So with that in mind, we can't say, this person said this about Christianity, so, they're out, and I'm done dealing with them. It's like, again, you think, well, what would Jesus do? wouldn't give up on the individual, right? When someone said, how many times do you forgive someone? And what did Jesus say, 70 times 70?
7.
You know, it's this huge number. And it's not that, okay, when that number
491, it's on.
Yeah. When you don't do it that last time, you're cut off. You know, Jesus gave this huge number to say, he could have just said a zillion times a zillion. You keep at it, you know, keep at it. Don't give up on anybody, right? And that's what Jesus is saying. You think about how God works in the Bible. Think about Paul, right? Or think about Saul of Tarsus. Here's someone who's actively seeking out Christians to kill them. And yet God had a plan for Saul's life. You know, it's like if we would have marked him out, I'm sure many Christians were thinking, boy, I would love if that guy would just die. Or
The apostles.
What's that?
The other apostles.
Yeah, the other apostles. I mean, like, they were thinking, you know, if a millstone could just so happen to fall from the sky one day and crush him, it wouldn't be a bad thing, God. I mean, think about...
That's a Flintstone moment.
It is a total Flintstone moment. Think about when God, I think it's Ananias, when God comes to Ananias and says, look, I want you to go and talk to Saul. And you can see his face, like saying, wait, who? Saul? Wait, are you sure? Yeah, exactly. Like, don't you, wait, are we talking about the same person here? You're not seeing what this guy's been doing around the town? You know, so, again, you can't mark anybody out. And I've gone, these are stark examples, right? But this is what we're talking about in church in the story of Jonah. You're talking about, the Ninevites or Assyrians, and these people were absolutely brutal. Not just brutal to other people, but brutal to the ancient Jews. Absolutely brutal. They destroyed the 10 tribes. They didn't just come down and say, okay, we'd like to live here, so, here's a little bit of money, now you guys go move some. No, they massacred them. They massacred them, and the remnants were scattered, never to be put back together until Jesus comes back again. It's done. That's who these people were, and that's who Jonah is now called to go talk to, hang out with. And it's such an interesting story. But he's called to go speak to the Ninevites. Why? Yeah. And so when you go through that story and you don't understand why Jonah doesn't want to go, is he afraid of them? Is he afraid of what they're going to do to him? Does he? And then it's at the end you know why. Because he hates them. And he knows that if they do good, if they turn and fly right, he knows what kind of God he serves. A loving and just God.
I gotta share this.
Yes.
So, yesterday I emailed my parents and I said, yeah, so tomorrow I'm liturgist and I'm reading the part in Jonah where the sailors cast lots and blame Jonah. And my dad emails back and says, I think they cast Jonah. Lots of different book.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
You thought of that quick?
I guess so. I mean, it was email, but I mean, he responded in like 5 minutes, and I was just like, that's hilarious.
That's awesome.
Are they coming today? Or they're in Texas?
They're in Texas.
Oh,
That's
Right.
awesome.
yeah.
I think that's a
They cast
different
Jonah.
book.
Yeah, they did.
Jonah was cast.
That's a little bit later.
That's right.
First they
That's
cast lots, and then they cast Jonah.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
That just was brilliant.
That's great. All right. Well, next week we have 3 minutes left. So next week we'll pick up with the Christian responsibility for non-Christians, and we'll finish this off. I have the next section already printed out, so we're ready to go next Sunday once we finish this. Any questions or comments about our section up to this point? All right.